I've spent the last month digging through something most people would never think twice about. Military mail. Not battles, not tactics, not kill ratios. Mail. And what I found buried in Australian War Memorial Archives, U.S. Postal Service records, and veteran testimonials from both countries blew my mind. Because here's what nobody talks about. During the Vietnam War, an Australian soldier at Nui Dat could write a letter home to his mum in Sydney, and she'd be reading it within 3 days. 3 days. Meanwhile, an American grunt in the same province, sometimes just a few kilometers away, would write to his girl in California. And that letter wouldn't arrive for 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes longer. Same war, same jungle, same heat. Completely different postal realities. And when I finally understood why, I realized this wasn't just a story about mail. It was a story about 2 completely different philosophies of how you fight a war and how you take care of the people fighting it. Vung Tau, South Vietnam, June 1971. Picture a corrugated tin shed on the edge of the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group base. The air so thick with humidity you could practically drink it. Inside, Corporal Ron Dyer of Bordertown, South Australia, is elbow-deep in canvas sacks. 130 bags of first-class mail pass through this shed every single month. Letters from mothers in Melbourne, packages from wives in Brisbane, tapes, actual reel-to-reel audio recordings from kids who miss their dads in Perth. Dyer sorts with mechanical precision. He knows the system. He trusts it. A letter dropped into the Australian Forces Post Office here at Vung Tau will be on a RAAF Hercules within hours, flying direct to Richmond Air Base in New South Wales. From Richmond, it enters the Australian domestic postal system. 3 days, door to door. Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, didn't matter. 3 days. Now walk 500 meters down the road to the American Post Office. A different world. A U.S. soldier hands over a letter addressed to Los Angeles. That letter will travel to Tan Son Nhut, then to a military mail terminal, then to a gateway hub, probably San Francisco, where it will be sorted, rebagged, and redistributed across the continental United States. 2 weeks minimum, often 3. Sometimes the letter arrives after the soldier who wrote it has already rotated home. What I found next stopped me cold. Because this wasn't a minor administrative hiccup. This was a systemic gap that shaped the morale, the psychology, and ultimately the fighting spirit of 2 allied armies standing shoulder to shoulder in the same war zone. And almost nobody has ever talked about it. When I first started pulling at this thread, I assumed the explanation would be simple. Distance, right? California is further from Vietnam than Sydney is. Case closed, except that's not even close to the full story. Sydney to Vung Tau is roughly 7,800 kilometers. San Francisco to Vung Tau is approximately 13,000 kilometers. So yes, there's a distance gap, but not enough to explain the difference between 3 days and 3 weeks. Aircraft don't care much about an extra 5,000 kilometers. A C-130 Hercules could cover that gap in a handful of hours. The real story, the one I kept uncovering layer by layer, was about logistics philosophy, scale, and a fundamental difference in how Australia and America organized their wars. The prevailing wisdom among American military planners was straightforward. Volume solves everything. The United States had 2.7 million personnel cycle through Vietnam over the course of the war. At peak strength, over 540,000 Americans were in country at once. The mail system serving them grew to 13 postal units operating up to 24 post offices across the entire Vietnam theater. That sounds impressive until you realize what it actually meant in practice. A sprawling, multi-node bureaucracy that routed every single letter through a chain of processing centers spanning 2 continents. Mail was the lifeblood, one former U.S. Army postal clerk recalled in an interview archived by the National Postal Museum. But the system was designed for a peacetime garrison in Germany, not a combat zone in Southeast Asia. Reading through these reports, I kept thinking, how did nobody fix this? The U.S. military knew mail mattered. Commanders at every level acknowledged that a soldier who doesn't hear from home is a soldier whose mind isn't on the mission. The Army had even experimented with helicopter mail drops during Vietnam, using green waterproof bags tossed out of Hueys into jungle clearings. But the bags blended in with the canopy too well. Soldiers couldn't find them. It was a metaphor for the whole system. Enormous effort, questionable results. The Australians, meanwhile, operated on a completely different principle. Their force was smaller, roughly 8,500 at peak strength. But their logistics were tighter, more direct, and specifically designed for the geography they were fighting in. General William Westmoreland once remarked that the Australians ran their operations with an efficiency that larger forces struggled to match. He wasn't talking about mail specifically, but he could have been. The Yanks couldn't believe how fast we got our letters. One Australian veteran told the Australian War Memorial's Oral History Project. They'd be waiting weeks. We'd be reading news from home that was 2 days old. It drove them mad. What I didn't understand yet, but was about to, was that this wasn't an accident. It was engineered. To understand why Australian mail moved so fast, you have to understand the RAAF's logistics architecture in Vietnam, and it starts with a unit most people have never heard of. On the 8th of August, 1964, 3 DHC-4 Caribou transport aircraft touched down at Vung Tau, marking the beginning of Australia's air presence in the Vietnam War. They belonged to RAAF Transport Flight Vietnam, soon to be redesignated Number 35 Squadron. And the troops on the ground quickly gave them a nickname that stuck: Wallaby Airlines. Over 7.5 years of continuous operations, Wallaby Airlines flew nearly 80,000 sorties, totaling 47,000 hours in the air. They carried more than 677,000 passengers, 36 million kilograms of freight, and, here's the number that matters for this story, 5 million kilograms of mail. 5 million kilograms. From a squadron that never had more than a dozen aircraft at any given time. But the Caribous were just the in-country piece. The real backbone was the RAAF Hercules fleet, based at Richmond in New South Wales. Number 36 Squadron had been operating C-130As since 1958. And when the war demanded more capacity, Number 37 Squadron was re-raised in February 1966 with 12 brand new C-130S. Together, these two squadrons established something that would prove transformative: a fortnightly courier service between Richmond and Bien Hoa, running continuously from November 1965 until 1972. This courier service carried personnel, spare parts, medical supplies, and, critically, mail. The route was direct: Richmond to Butterworth in Malaysia for a refueling stop, then onward to Vung Tau. The return leg brought casualties for medical evacuation and, of course, outgoing mail from the troops. In 1967, a C-130E from Number 37 Squadron demonstrated what this aircraft could do when it flew 51 medical evacuation cases non-stop from Vung Tau to Richmond, 7,165 kilometers, in 14 hours and 10 minutes. The system was elegant in its simplicity. A soldier at Nui Dat writes a letter. It goes to the Australian Forces Post Office at 1 ALSG in Vung Tau. It's bagged, tagged, and loaded onto the next Hercules heading south. Within 24 to 36 hours, that letter is at Richmond. From Richmond, it enters Australia Post's domestic network. Another day, maybe two, and it's in a letterbox in suburban Sydney, Melbourne, or Brisbane. No intermediate processing centers, no multi-hub routing, no transfers between civilian and military postal jurisdictions halfway around the world. Just a direct military air bridge from the combat zone to the home country. Now compare that with what an American letter went through. From October 1967, all personal correspondence to and from Australian forces in Vietnam was carried free of charge. The government absorbed the cost entirely. American soldiers, meanwhile, could write free on their letters in lieu of a stamp. But the logistics chain those letters entered was vastly more complex. An American soldier's letter would leave the unit mail clerk's hands and travel to the nearest Army post office. From there, it moved to a consolidation point, often Tan Son Nut near Saigon. Then it flew to a joint military mail terminal, likely in Japan or the Philippines, before being forwarded to the United States via military or contracted civilian aircraft. Upon arriving at a gateway city, San Francisco for Pacific Mail, New York for Atlantic, the letter transferred into the United States Postal Service system. Then it was sorted, routed, and delivered like any other piece of domestic mail. Each of those handoffs added time. Each sorting facility added a day, sometimes more. And for a system handling mail for over 500,000 personnel at peak, the sheer volume was staggering. The Korean War had seen 11 tons of mail per day flowing into the theater. Vietnam dwarfed that figure. The system was built for efficiency at scale, one military postal historian noted. The problem was that scale and speed are often enemies. The moment this story crystallized for me came when I found accounts from American soldiers who had direct contact with Australian units, men who saw the disparity with their own eyes. Nui Dat, Phuoc Tuy Province, 1968. At the 1st Australian Task Force Base, Australian and American personnel occasionally crossed paths during joint operations, liaison duties, and shared logistics. And the conversations about mail became a recurring theme in veteran recollections. One American liaison officer attached to the Australian task force later recalled the shock of watching an Australian corporal reading a letter from his wife describing events from just 3 days earlier. "I hadn't heard from my wife in almost a month," he said. This guy was reading about what happened on his daughter's birthday, and the birthday was 4 days ago. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The disparity was more than an inconvenience. Research consistently showed that mail was the single most important morale factor for deployed soldiers, ranking above hot meals, recreational facilities, and even R&R leave. A soldier who receives regular mail from home maintains psychological resilience. A soldier who waits 3 weeks between letters begins to fill the silence with anxiety about relationships, about family emergencies, about whether anyone back home still cares. The American system, for all its scale, had critical failure points that compounded the delays. First, there was the routing problem. Mail from the west coast of the United States, California, Oregon, Washington, had a relatively efficient path to Vietnam via the San Francisco Gateway. But mail from the East Coast or the southern states had to travel domestically to the West Coast first, adding 3 to 4 days before it even left American soil. A letter from a mother in Georgia to her son in Phu Bai might spend nearly a week just traversing the continental United States. Second, there was the individual rotation system. Unlike the Australians, who deployed as formed units with relatively stable postal addresses, American soldiers rotated individually on 12-month tours. This meant the APO system was constantly updating. Soldiers arriving, departing, transferring between units. A letter addressed to a man who'd moved from the 1st Cavalry Division to a different unit might chase him across the country for days. Third, and this is what really struck me, there was the cargo competition problem. American military aircraft in Vietnam were overwhelmingly committed to combat operations. Troop movements, ammunition resupply, medevac flights. Mail competed for cargo space on aircraft that had more urgent priorities. The USPS eventually implemented programs like parcel airlift, which placed mail on civilian flights with excess capacity. But this was a workaround, not a solution. The Australians never had this problem because they had dedicated logistics aircraft, the Hercules courier flights, that treated mail as a primary cargo category, not a secondary one. The RAAF's mission explicitly included logistics support and medical evacuation, and mail rode alongside medical supplies and personnel on every southbound flight. I spent weeks trying to verify these delivery time differences through official records. Every source I checked told the same story. The Australian War Memorial Archives contained photographs of the AFPO at Vung Tau, with captions noting the 130 bags of first-class mail processed monthly. American veterans' accounts consistently describe 2 to 3 week delays, with some packages taking over a month. The contrast was real, documented, and persistent throughout the war. The psychological impact was measurable. Australian unit cohesion, already strong due to the regimental system and formed unit deployments, was reinforced by the knowledge that home was never more than a few days away by post. American soldiers, dealing with longer mail delays on top of the individual rotation system that constantly broke up unit bonds, faced a qualitatively different emotional experience of the same war. "Every day is Monday in Vietnam," one American soldier named Robinson wrote home in a letter preserved by PBS's American Experience Project. He was killed 5 days later by a booby trap. His letters, when they arrived, came in clusters, sometimes nothing for weeks, then several at once, because that's how the system worked. The mail moved in waves, not streams. As the war progressed, both systems evolved, but in characteristically different ways. The American military, to its credit, recognized the mail problem and threw resources at it. The Vietnam theater eventually operated 13 postal units with 24 post offices. Green, waterproof mail bags were designed for helicopter aerial delivery to remote units in the jungle. Though, as the National Postal Museum documented, the camouflage pattern that was supposed to protect the bags from enemy observation also made them nearly impossible for friendly troops to find in dense canopy. The USPS introduced new programs to accelerate military mail. The parcel airlift system, which placed parcels on any available civilian or military flight with spare capacity, became standard practice. Priority was given to first-class letters over packages, and during holiday periods, when mail volume spiked dramatically, additional contract flights were chartered specifically for postal cargo. But the fundamental architecture never changed. American mail still routed through gateway hubs. It still transferred between military and civilian postal systems. It still competed with operational cargo for aircraft space. The improvements shaved days off the average delivery time. But they couldn't eliminate the structural delays built into a system designed to serve 500,000 people spread across dozens of bases in a combat zone. The Australians, meanwhile, refined what was already working. As one ALSG grew into a major logistic base at Vung Tau, the postal operation became more sophisticated. The AFPO handled not just letters, but audio tapes, reel-to-reel recordings that soldiers could exchange with their families, hearing actual voices from home. By the late 1960s, affordable recording equipment had become widespread enough that voice messages became a regular feature of the Australian mail system. From October 1967, the Australian government made all personal correspondence to and from Vietnam completely free. Letters, postcards, greeting cards, audio tapes, everything. This wasn't just a nice gesture. It removed a friction point from the system. Soldiers didn't need to worry about stamps or postage calculations. They just wrote, sealed, and dropped their letters at the AFPO. The system did the rest. The RAAF Hercules flights continued their relentless schedule. Number 36 and Number 37 squadrons maintained the courier service throughout the war, linking Richmond directly to Vietnam. When a soldier was wounded and evacuated by Hercules, his outgoing mail often flew on the same aircraft. When replacement personnel flew north, they carried incoming mail bags alongside their kit. Every flight served double or triple duty. The Hercules was our lifeline, one former ALSG postal clerk recalled. Not just for mail, for everything. But the mail was what the blokes cared about most. You could see it on their faces at mail call. American soldiers adapted too, but often through individual initiative rather than systemic improvement. Veterans' accounts describe elaborate personal systems, numbering letters so recipients could read them in order regardless of when they arrived, using coded references to bypass potential censorship concerns, writing on C-ration packaging when proper stationery wasn't available. The grunt-level creativity was extraordinary, born from the frustration of a system that couldn't keep pace with the emotional needs of the men it served. One American practice that emerged specifically because of mail delays was the cluster letter, a single long letter written over several days, with dated entries almost like a diary, sent as one piece when the opportunity arose. It was a pragmatic adaptation to a system where you couldn't count on mail going out regularly. The New Zealand forces, operating alongside the Australians, benefited from a similar direct logistics chain. The Royal New Zealand Air Force operated a regular shuttle service between Tan Son Nhut, Vung Tau, and Quy Nhon using Bristol freighter aircraft, providing another dedicated mail route for Commonwealth forces. What the pattern revealed, the more I mapped it out, was that the mail disparity wasn't really about mail at all. It was about the difference between a small force with a direct, dedicated supply chain and a massive force with a distributed, multi-layered logistics network. The Americans had more of everything: more aircraft, more postal units, more personnel, more funding. But more, in this case, meant slower. By 1969 to 1970, the Australian mail system was operating at peak efficiency. The RAAF's logistics infrastructure was mature, the AFPO at Vung Tau was fully established, and the Hercules courier service had been running without interruption for nearly 5 years. The numbers tell the story. Wallaby Airlines alone had carried 5 million kilograms of mail over its operational life, an average of nearly 700,000 kilograms per year across a squadron that never exceeded 12 aircraft. The Hercules flights added strategic-level capacity on top of that, linking Vietnam directly to the Australian mainland with scheduled regularity. For the Australian soldier, mail wasn't an event, it was a constant. Letters arrived so reliably that troops could almost predict when they'd hear from home. This predictability was, in itself, a psychological asset. The uncertainty that plagued American soldiers. Will I hear from her this week? Has something happened? Why hasn't anyone written? Was largely absent from the Australian experience. American veterans describe mail call as both the best and worst moment of any given week. The best because letters from home could transform a soldier's entire outlook. The worst because when your name wasn't called, the silence was devastating. With deliveries arriving in irregular clusters due to the multi-hub routing system, an American soldier might go 2 weeks with nothing, then receive 6 letters in a single day. By which point, the emotional trajectory of those letters no longer matched the soldier's current reality. The cumulative impact on morale was significant enough that it shows up in unit-level assessments and veteran oral histories from both armies. Australian units in Phuoc Tuy province consistently reported high morale metrics, and while mail was only one factor among many, including unit cohesion, leadership quality, and the relatively contained area of operations. Postal reliability was repeatedly cited as a contributor. One Australian battalion commander noted that the predictability of mail deliveries allowed him to schedule operations with confidence that his men's minds would be settled. "A bloke who got a letter from his wife yesterday fights differently than a bloke who hasn't heard from home in a fortnight," he observed. Not better, not worse, but more settled, more focused. The American military recognized this reality too. Every commander from platoon leader to Westmoreland himself understood that mail equaled morale. But understanding the problem and solving it were two different things when your postal system served more than 500,000 people and spanned 2 continents. What no one seems to have noticed until now is that the Australian advantage wasn't about caring more. The Americans cared enormously. The entire APO system, the helicopter drops, the contracted flights, the free postage privilege all demonstrated that. The advantage was architectural. Australia had built a direct pipeline. America had built a network. And in the specific context of a war fought thousands of miles from home, the pipeline won. When the last RAAF Hercules lifted off from Vung Tau in December 1972, carrying the final Australian troops home, it also carried the last bags of Australian military mail from Vietnam. The postal system that had connected 60,000 Australians to their families over 10 years of war had operated with a reliability that remains remarkable by any standard. The U.S. military postal system, despite its challenges, eventually processed hundreds of millions of letters and packages over the course of the war. It was, in absolute terms, one of the greatest logistical achievements in postal history. But in relative terms, in the experience of the individual soldier waiting for word from home, it couldn't match what a smaller, more focused system achieved through directness and simplicity. The lessons carried forward. Modern military postal operations, from Desert Storm to Afghanistan and Iraq, have increasingly emphasized direct air bridges and reduced handoffs, principles that the Australian-Vietnam-era system embodied instinctively. The Military Postal Service Agency, created in 1980 to consolidate U.S. military postal operations, was itself an acknowledgement that the fragmented approach of the Vietnam era needed reform. What researching this story taught me about warfare goes beyond logistics. It taught me that the most powerful weapon in any army's arsenal might be a folded piece of paper in a white envelope. That the distance between a soldier and home isn't measured in kilometers. It's measured in days without contact. And that sometimes a smaller country with a simpler plan can solve a problem that a superpower's vast machinery cannot. I keep coming back to that shed at Vung Tau. Corporal Ron Dyer, sorting through 130 bags of mail, connecting thousands of soldiers to the people they loved. 3 days from the jungle to a letterbox in Sydney. In a war defined by failure and frustration, that quiet efficiency might be one of the most human success stories to come out of Vietnam.